Throughout history, governments have often done selfish acts in the name of power and money, while turning a blind eye to the consequences of their actions. In the 19th century, the British Empire started a bloody and traumatic war against China to keep control of their illegal drug smuggling enterprise. They strategically marketed opium, the highly addictive narcotic, as a commodity for the Chinese wealthy elites, but by 1840, 2,553 tons of opium were illegally imported into China. As the number of Chinese opium addicts increased, China attempted to halt British trade. But instead of complying with Chinese laws, the technologically advanced British fleet bullied China into legalizing the opium trade. Welcome to Uncharted History. Today, we delve into the horrors of the First Opium War and uncover Britain's intimidation strategy, which transformed the Chinese Empire into a nation of opium addicts. At the end of the 18th century, China was closed to foreign trade, unlike other European nations. Chinese commerce was focused inward, the empire was self-reliant, and they had strict foreign trade policies. China didn't need foreign goods, but foreign countries needed Chinese goods. Silk, porcelain, and teas were coveted by wealthy European nations. Britain alone imported over 10 million pounds of tea per year. Wanting to hedge Chinese interests, the Hong Trading Monopoly, the only organization with the power to tax and regulate foreign trade, restricted trade with foreign merchants to only one port, Canton. The British merchants believed in free trade, so they despised the trade guidelines imposed by China that prevented merchants from making a real substantial profit that would justify such a long journey. On top of that, the British government was faced with a major problem: the enormous trade deficit with China. Millions of pounds of silver flowed out of Britain and into China as demand for Chinese tea, silk, and porcelain increased, but nothing was flowing from China to Britain. So, to increase trade, the British urgently needed to find a commodity the Chinese would desperately need. After many failed attempts to find the right product, it was evident that China didn't need British clocks, carriages, or even telescopes. However, there was a plant called Lacryma papaveris, or opium, which was used as a powdered pain reliever in tea back in Britain. Wealthy British nobles smoked opium because it was pleasurable and quite addictive. As a result, the East India Company, or EIC, responsible for half of the world's trade between 1750 and 1850, holding a monopoly in British trade to China, saw this plant as a viable option and started to grow it intensely in the Bengali region of eastern India. Unfortunately for the East India Company, their cheap Bengal opium had been banned in China since 1729. So, what could the EIC do? The only thing they could do: illegally smuggle opium into China. Opium smoking began as a pastime for the upper classes of Chinese society, but by the 1830s, everyone from government officials to merchants, monks, and even women were smoking opium. Near the middle of the 19th century, the number of Chinese opium addicts increased dramatically, and the empire proclaimed an opium crisis. To make matters worse, this illegal trade meant that China was sending vast amounts of silver to Britain, reversing the Chinese trade surplus. The emperor was urged to legalize and tax opium, but he refused and decided to ban the opium trade completely to try to avoid an opium epidemic. In 1839, Chinese Emperor Daoguang appointed the honest and trustworthy Viceroy of Huguang, Lin Zexu, to put an end to the opium trade and crisis. After his heartfelt letter to Queen Victoria was lost and never delivered, Lin saw that diplomatic relations would not bear fruit. So he resorted to violence. In his first 3 months in charge, Lin captured an outstanding 2.37 million pounds of illegal opium. However, his efficiency would bring China to its knees. When Lin arrived at Canton in January, he placed a coastal blockade on the Pearl River so that foreign ships were blocked from entering China and their supplies were confiscated. Wanting to send a clear message, Lin burned all of the seized opium on the Pearl River near Humen Beach and proclaimed that the penalty for anyone, foreign or Chinese, caught smuggling opium would be death. However, even with such harsh trade penalties, the British merchants would not readily accept these terms, and as a result, tensions escalated. In July 1839, two British soldiers drunk on rice liqueur assaulted and killed an innocent Chinese villager named Sim Sha Su in Kowloon. Even though the British men were arrested and paid compensation to the family of the victim, there was one fatal problem with their trial. Instead of being tried by the Chinese, they were tried under British law. Seeing the trial as an insult to Chinese sovereignty, Lin decided to teach the British a lesson and cut off all supplies to British ships. Outraged, the British Army led a minor naval battle known as the Battle of Kowloon, fought on September 4, 1839, to regain access to their supply lines. 4 British boats fought against 3 junks and 1 Chinese fort. In the battle, 2 Chinese soldiers were killed, and Britain emerged victorious, securing the necessary supplies for their ships. What the British and Chinese didn't know is that this tiny battle would become the precursor to the First Opium War. A simple naval skirmish led to an all-out war that killed around 3,200 people, most of which were Chinese. While most members of the British Parliament were aware of opium dangers, merchants felt it was their duty to protect British products and their trade. As a result, in January 1840, 271 members voted for military action against the Celestial Empire and their new, unrealistic trade terms, compared to 262 who voted against it. By June 1840, a reinforcement fleet arrived in China made up of 15 barracks ships, 25 smaller boats, and 4 steam-powered gunboats. The first assault was launched in July 1840 on the Chusan archipelago. After the British destroyed 12 small junks from the Qing Dynasty, they captured the port of Dinghai and the city of Chusan. Despite having inferior numbers, the superior British army and weapons easily overpowered the Chinese, who were using outdated weapons. Still, the British even had an impervious weapon. HMS Nemesis, one of the first steam-powered iron warships, destroyed many enemy ships in battle and took no casualties on the British side. Immediately after the defeat by HMS Nemesis, Elliot and Chishan, Lin's replacement as Viceroy of Liangwang, reopened negotiations, and the Chinese agreed to pay the British 1 million silver pounds sterling in compensation, offered to create a direct diplomatic link between the two countries, and seceded Hong Kong to Great Britain. When Chishan returned to the emperor bearing the news, he was sentenced to death. In February, fighting resumed as the British ships moved up the Pearl River at the port of Canton. By March, the British cleared the Chinese ships guarding the river passage, and they reached Canton, where they captured the port and reopened trade. When the emperor heard the news, they gathered a force of 50,000 men to fight the British 6,000. On the night of May 21st, the Qing attacked the British army. For 10 days, the battle raged between the outnumbered British and the formidable Chinese army, backed up by the Cantonese villagers. Unfortunately, by May 30th, the Chinese army, despite their large numbers, fell to the British. Canton was fully occupied by Great Britain. If the Qing Dynasty wanted the British to retreat from Canton, they would have to pay a fee. The Chinese generals lied to the emperor, saying the battle was a success, so the imperial court began planning the recapture of Hong Kong. Reality, however, was very different. Not only was the battle not a success, but the British began moving north from Canton to Beijing, wanting to put pressure on China's capital. The trip north was a difficult one. The British had to fight the Chinese Navy and deal with countless blockades on their way. By June 14th, the British fleet was in the Yangtze River, the most strategically advantageous river in Chinese commerce. The British easily captured Shanghai and created an opening to Nanking, which represented the center of China's south. The Qing Dynasty fell quickly because their navy was inferior and their armies weren't fit to deal with such a technologically advanced enemy. Finally, at the stronghold of Zhenjiang, the British army took the stronghold easily. With this victory, the British Empire made Nanking vulnerable and severed the Chinese south from the rest of the Chinese Empire. By the time Emperor Daoguang became aware of the harsh reality, it was too late. The British victory led to the Treaty of Nanking, signed on August 29, 1842, marking the end of the First Opium War. But at what cost? It was an unequal and unjust treaty that forced the Chinese Empire to pay indemnities to the Queen for the destroyed opium and the war. The indemnities put a major toll on China, since they represented half of the annual revenue of the government. China's territorial integrity would be a thing of the past, since they agreed to cede Hong Kong to the British. Plus, a quote-unquote fair and reasonable tariff was established as a result. After the Treaty of Nanking, China opened more ports to British trade. Instead of trading only at Canton, British merchants could go to other treaty ports and trade with anyone, putting an end to the almost century-old Canton System. However, the Treaty of Nanking was very dangerous for a second reason. It was like dropping blood in shark-infested waters. China was no longer the powerful empire the colonial powers feared. After learning about China's weakness, the imperial sharks, France and the US, forced the Qing Dynasty to sign more unjust treaties, forever changing Chinese culture and civilization through westernization. When Emperor Daoguang passed away in 1850, his 19-year-old son succeeded the throne, weakening the Celestial Empire even further. China was turned into an exploited gold mine for the West, preying on weakness. The British, driven by their desire for profit, single-handedly dismantled one of the greatest empires of the 19th century. And they did it again not even 2 decades later, when the Second Opium War began. This is Uncharted History. See you in our next video.